The morning broke with a slate-colored sky, the kind that seemed to press low over the rooftops, and Lydia Maddox woke to the sound of rain battering her apartment windows in relentless sheets. It was the kind of storm that swallowed light and sound alike, a muted grey world that felt suffocating in its weight, and as she sat up, brushing damp strands of hair from her cheek, she realized the weather was almost identical to that night 31 years ago when her sister Claire vanished. The anniversary always found her unprepared, no matter how many times she told herself she was ready, and the storm outside was like an old enemy come to remind her of all she had lost. She pushed back the blankets, the chill in the air making her shiver, and moved to the small kitchen where she filled the kettle, her motions slow and deliberate, as if each was a ritual meant to anchor her. On the wall above the counter hung a framed black and white photo of Claire, her smile bright beneath the brim of her paramedic cap. The light in her eyes unclouded by the shadows Lydia now knew had been gathering around her in those final weeks. She thought of the details she had memorized from the police report, the last call Claire had taken, the ambulance found parked on a narrow back road with its lights still flashing, engine still warm, but no trace of her anywhere. Lydia had read those lines so many times, they lived in her like an unwanted prayer, each word heavy with absence. The kettle began to hiss, and she poured the boiling water over a tea bag, the rising steam fogging her glasses. She thought about the memorial scheduled for the afternoon, the rows of folding chairs set up near the old EMS station, the speeches from officials who never seemed to know what to say, and the silent faces of families clutching photographs of those they had lost. She would go, as she always did, because it was one of the few ways she still felt connected to her sister. But she also knew the hours leading up to it would stretch long and cold, her mind drifting toward that endless question of what had really happened. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, rattling against the glass like impatient fingers, and she wondered if somewhere beyond the reach of this storm there were answers buried in the dark soil of the past, waiting for someone stubborn enough to dig. She took a long sip of tea, letting the warmth settle in her chest, and looked out at the trembling branches beyond the window. The wind pushed the rain sideways, making the world blur as if it were an old photograph dissolving at the edges, and in that moment she could almost believe she was looking into the same storm her sister had driven into, the one that had swallowed her whole and left nothing but questions in its wake. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle by the time Lydia reached her mother's house, the familiar white clapboard home standing quietly at the end of the street as if it too carried the weight of memory. Evelyn Maddox opened the door before Lydia could knock, her eyes warm yet clouded with the same sadness that had never truly left. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, the scent of a home that had weathered decades of both love and loss. Lydia followed her mother down the narrow hallway, her gaze brushing over the framed photographs that lined the walls, snapshots of birthdays, graduations, and small, unremarkable days that had become priceless simply because they had passed before the night everything changed. Evelyn stopped at the closet and opened it, revealing the garment bag that had hung there for 31 years, its zipper slightly tarnished with age. Inside was Claire's paramedic uniform, pressed and preserved as though she might walk in one day and need it for her next shift. Evelyn's hands lingered on the fabric, her fingers tracing the embroidered name patch as if it might somehow tether her daughter back to them. When she began to speak, her voice took on that careful, steady cadence Lydia knew so well, the same way she had told the story countless times before, each word carried like a stone. She spoke of the final dispatch call Claire had taken, a vague report of a possible injury on a back road out by the river, the kind of call that should have been routine. She remembered how Claire had been in good spirits when she left, her dark hair pulled back, her smile quick and confident, her boots splashing through puddles as she jogged to the ambulance. Evelyn described how, minutes later, the vehicle had been found parked in that remote stretch of road, lights still flashing against the trees, the engine warm enough to suggest she had just stepped away, yet the cab was empty and there were no footprints leading into the woods. Lydia listened quietly, the image forming in her mind as vividly as if she was seeing it for the first time. The rain-slick road glistening under the strobing lights, the air heavy with the metallic hum of the idling engine, and the silence pressing in like something alive. Evelyn's voice trembled slightly as she recounted how the search had begun almost immediately, neighbors joining law enforcement, dogs picking up a scent only to lose it within yards, as if Claire had simply been lifted from the earth. Lydia placed a hand over her mother's, feeling the fragile tension in her fingers, and wondered how many more times they could bear to tell this story without breaking under the weight of its unanswered end. The rain tapped gently against the window now, a softer rhythm than before, and in that quiet, Lydia could almost hear the distant echo of sirens fading into the night, carrying her sister away to a place no one had yet been able to reach. The memorial had always been a quiet gathering, but this year the grey sky and damp air seemed to press more heavily over the small crowd assembled near the old EMS station, the folding chairs arranged in neat rows on the patch of lawn that was still slick from the morning rain. Lydia moved through the familiar faces, exchanging soft greetings and brief embraces, her gaze drawn to the framed photographs resting on easels along the walkway, each one a frozen reminder of the people they had lost. It was there that she saw Tom Keller standing slightly apart from the others, his posture stooped with age, yet still carrying the bearing of someone who had once thrived in the chaos of emergencies. When their eyes met, he offered a faint smile and stepped toward her, the brim of his worn cap shadowing his expression. Without preamble, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small sealed envelope, its edges worn as though it had been handled many times, but never opened. He told her he had been keeping it for years, waiting for the right moment to pass it on, though he admitted he could not explain why today felt like that moment. Lydia took it with a cautious curiosity, the paper warm from his hands, and when she opened it, the scent of old photo paper rose faintly in the air. Inside were several photographs, some she recognized from old news articles, but others she had never seen before, each one capturing fragments of the night her sister vanished. Her fingers trembled as she sifted through them, the glossy surfaces reflecting the muted daylight. One image in particular made her breath catch. The shot was of the ambulance parked on that lonely back road, its emergency lights casting fractured beams against the wet pavement. And in the far left corner of the frame, almost swallowed by shadow, was a human figure. The shape was indistinct, the features blurred by distance and darkness, yet there was something deliberate about the way the figure stood, angled slightly toward the vehicle as if watching. Lydia studied it closely, her pulse quickening, while Tom explained that the photo had been taken by a volunteer firefighter who arrived on the scene before the road was officially closed. He confessed he had never shown it to anyone, worried it would be dismissed as nothing more than a trick of light or a bystander caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the image had never stopped bothering him. The noise of the memorial faded around them as Lydia held the photograph, her mind returning to the stories she had heard, the details her mother recited, the endless hours of imagining what might have happened in those missing minutes. She felt the same chill she had as a child standing too close to the ocean, aware of the pull beneath the surface, unseen but undeniable, and she knew this image, blurred and uncertain as it was, might be the first ripple of something long hidden finally breaking into view. The apartment felt smaller when Lydia returned from the memorial, the dim light from the storm pressing against the windows and drawing long shadows across the floor. She set her bag on the table and stood for a moment in the stillness, the envelope of photographs resting beside her as though it carried its own quiet weight. Her eyes drifted toward the bookshelf in the corner, where a small scuffed box sat wedged between stacks of old notebooks, its cardboard edges worn and frayed from years of being moved but never opened. She crossed the room and pulled it down, the dust clinging to her fingertips, and placed it on the table. Inside was Claire's voice recorder, a black, palm-sized device that had been recovered from the ambulance's dashboard on the night she vanished. The sight of it stirred something in Lydia, a mix of longing and dread, as if she were about to hear her sister speak from across the gulf of decades. She found the bag of microcassettes tucked neatly beside it, each labeled in Claire's tidy handwriting, the ink slightly faded. Most were marked with dates and shift times, and as she slid the first one into the recorder, she heard the easy rhythm of routine chatter, dispatch updates, and the occasional burst of static that punctuated long nights on the road. She moved through them one by one, listening to her sister's calm, steady voice as she described patient conditions, requested backup, or joked softly with her partner in the quiet hours before dawn. Then she reached a tape with no label at all, its plastic shell clear and unmarked. She hesitated before pressing play, the machine clicking softly as the reel began to turn. Claire's voice came through almost immediately, but there was a strain to it, a sharpness Lydia had not heard before. The sound of wind tore through the background, rattling against the microphone, and rain struck in heavy, uneven bursts that made the words harder to catch. Claire was speaking quickly, her tone low and urgent, as if she were trying to keep her voice from carrying beyond the confines of the cab. Lydia leaned closer, straining to make out the words, catching fragments about an address that did not match the one she had been dispatched to, and a vehicle that had been following her since she left the station. The wind rose suddenly in the recording, drowning her out for a moment, and when her voice returned, there was a tremor beneath it, something Lydia could feel even without understanding the full meaning. Then, without warning, a sharp metallic bang rang out, followed by the scrape of something against the vehicle, and Claire's voice broke off in a muffled shout, abrupt and final. The tape clicked as it reached the end, the silence that followed seeming heavier than the sound itself. Lydia sat motionless, her hands curled tightly around the recorder, the storm outside lashing against the glass as if echoing the one that had carried her sister into the unknown all those years ago. The rain had eased into a thin mist by the time Lydia pulled up to the small bungalow on the edge of town. The paint weathered to a soft grey, and the garden overgrown in a way that suggested its owner had long since stopped tending to the world outside her door. Marla Jensen answered with the screen door still latched, her eyes narrowing for a moment before recognition softened her features. She was in her 70s now, her hair a pale silver pulled back into a loose bun, her voice carrying the rasp of years and cigarettes as she invited Lydia inside. The living room smelled faintly of old coffee and the faint tang of paper, stacks of magazines and folders lined neatly along the walls as if they were too important to throw away. They sat at a small table near the window, the light falling in muted patterns across Marla's worn hands, and Lydia wasted little time before explaining why she had come. Marla listened quietly, her gaze steady, and when Lydia mentioned the date of Claire's disappearance, something flickered in her expression, a shadow of memory she could not quite conceal. She leaned back slowly, her fingers drumming once against the tabletop, and said she had been the dispatcher on duty that night. Her tone was matter-of-fact at first, describing how the call came in as a possible injury on a rural back road, the kind of vague report that could mean anything from a broken leg to a prank. She explained that Claire had been the nearest available unit, so she was dispatched without hesitation, her partner occupied with another call miles away. Marla's eyes darkened as she spoke of what happened next, how within an hour of sending Claire out, the ambulance was found parked and empty, the engine still warm. The strangest part, she said, was that when she reviewed the logs, the originating phone number for that call could not be traced to any residence or payphone. It was as if it had come from nowhere at all. She paused then, glancing toward the window as though checking for something beyond the glass, and admitted in a quieter voice that she had always believed the call was a trap. She remembered trying to raise questions, to suggest that someone had lured Claire to that spot for a reason. But before she could press the matter, her supervisor came in, took over the incident review, and told her firmly to leave it alone. Within hours, she said, the call was logged as routine and closed, the questions swept aside. Lydia felt the words settle over her like a weight, the confirmation of something she had long suspected tightening in her chest. Marla reached for her coffee, her hands trembling just enough to make the cup clink against the saucer, and said she had learned to live with not knowing, though the memory still woke her in the night when the wind outside sounded too much like that storm. The drive out to the place where the ambulance had been found felt longer than Lydia expected, the narrow roads winding away from town until the houses thinned and the landscape seemed to fold in on itself, quiet and watchful. The gravel road appeared almost suddenly, its entrance marked by a pair of leaning mailboxes with numbers too faded to read, the ground beneath them soft with moss and wet leaves. She turned onto it slowly, the tires crunching over loose stone, and let the car roll forward until the trees rose up on either side, tall pines packed so densely they seemed to swallow the light. The air grew cooler in their shade, carrying the damp, earthy scent of soil and old rain, and for a moment, she could almost imagine the flashing lights of the ambulance against the green and grey, the steady thrum of its engine waiting for someone who never returned. She parked where the police report had said the vehicle was found, stepping out into the quiet that pressed against her ears until it was almost a sound of its own. The gravel was uneven underfoot, weeds pushing up through its surface, and the road ahead narrowed until it was little more than a path swallowed by undergrowth. She walked slowly, her eyes sweeping the edges where the forest crept forward, the wind beginning to stir with a low, restless whisper through the branches. Without warning, the sky darkened, heavy clouds drawing together as the breeze sharpened into something colder, the shift so sudden it made her pause. A fine mist began to fall, speckling her jacket, and she pulled the zipper higher as she continued on, the smell of rain mixing with the resin of the pines. That was when she saw it, a flash of rusted metal half hidden among the shadows to her right. Stepping off the road, she pushed through the ferns and low brush until she stood before it, a road sign so corroded that most of the lettering was gone, the edges jagged with decay. What remained was barely legible, a single word at the bottom that looked like part of a place name, though she did not recognize it. She crouched, brushing away the damp leaves at its base, wondering why something so close to the site had never appeared in the original photographs. The sign leaned slightly, its post rotted where it met the earth, as if it had been here far longer than the road itself. Lydia took out her phone, snapping several pictures, the soft patter of rain around her becoming steadier, building toward something heavier. The pines swayed with the wind, their tops groaning like old beams under strain, and she felt a prickling along her neck, an instinctive sense that the air had shifted in more than just weather. Tucking the phone back into her pocket, she stepped away from the sign, her gaze lingering on it as she made her way back toward the car, the rain beginning to fall harder, the sound like 1,000 small footsteps following her out of the trees. The call came just after dusk, the rain outside tapping a restless rhythm against Lydia's windows, as if urging her to answer quickly. The voice on the other end was deep and deliberate, introducing himself as Harlan Briggs, and before she could ask how he had found her number, he explained that he had read her recent article in the local paper about Claire's disappearance. There was a pause, the faint sound of wind on his end, before he said he had been out in that storm back in 1992, caught on a back road when the sky turned black, and the rain came down so hard it erased the world beyond his headlights. Lydia listened without interrupting, her pen poised above the notepad on her desk, as he described trying to find his way home that night, his wipers working furiously against sheets of water that seemed to fall sideways. He said he remembered passing an ambulance pulled to the side of the road, its emergency lights strobing red and white against the curtain of rain. But what struck him even then was how it sat at an angle, one wheel half off the gravel and into the weeds, as if it had stopped suddenly. Nearby, just barely visible through the downpour, was an old brown pickup idling in the opposite lane, its headlights low and its shape bulky enough to be unsettling. Harlan admitted he could not see if anyone was inside either vehicle, the storm too fierce to make out faces or movement, but he recalled the sense that the two were connected, positioned like pieces in a scene he had interrupted without meaning to. He told her that within moments he had driven past, the wind rocking his truck and the rain hammering so hard he could barely keep to the road, and when he glanced in the rearview mirror, both vehicles had vanished from sight. He could not say if they had driven off or if the wall of rain had simply swallowed them, but the absence had been immediate and absolute. Lydia's mind raced as she wrote down every word, the image of that strange tableau taking shape in her thoughts, fitting uneasily alongside the photographs and recordings she had already gathered. Harlan said he had kept quiet all these years, thinking the detail would not matter or that no one would believe him, but reading her article had stirred something in him, the way seeing an old wound in someone else can make you feel the throb of your own. He ended by saying he did not know what it meant, only that the memory had never left him, especially the sound of that pickup's low engine purring under the roar of the storm, a sound that seemed to belong to a moment that should never have been. As the line went quiet, Lydia stared at her notes, the rain outside growing heavier, blurring the lights of the street until it looked as though the storm of '92 had found its way back to her door. The diner was nearly empty when Lydia pushed open the door, the bell above it giving a soft chime that seemed too bright for the hour. The neon sign outside cast a dull red glow across the windows, and the faint hum of the refrigeration units filled the silence between the low murmur of two truckers seated at the far end of the counter. Tom Keller was already there, hunched in a corner booth with a cup of coffee clasped in both hands, his eyes flicking toward the door the moment she stepped inside. He gestured for her to join him, his shoulders tight, as if braced against more than just the chill of the night. Lydia slid into the seat across from him, the vinyl cool against her skin, and waited for him to speak. For a long moment he said nothing, only tracing a finger along the rim of his cup, his gaze fixed on the dark liquid as though it might offer him a way to arrange his thoughts. When he finally began, his voice was low and deliberate, carrying the weight of something long kept hidden. He told her that in the weeks before Claire vanished, she had quietly been looking into a series of odd emergency calls, incidents that never seemed to match what dispatch had reported. The calls were always to remote, rural locations, often without a clear address, and when responders arrived, they would find no patient, no caller, sometimes nothing but an empty stretch of road or an abandoned building. Claire had started to see a pattern, he said, one that she had only confided to him in fragments, and the night of the storm she had told him she thought she finally knew who was behind it. Tom paused then, glancing toward the diner's front window where the wet street gleamed under the flickering light of a lamppost, and lowered his voice even further. He suspected that whoever had been making those calls had used the chaos of the storm to set a final trap, and that Claire had walked straight into it. He leaned in, his eyes searching hers, and told her she needed to be careful, that some of the people connected to those calls might still be out there and might not welcome her questions. Lydia felt the words sink into her like cold water, each one stirring the unease that had been growing since she first began looking into her sister's case. The waitress came by with a pot of coffee, refilling their cups without asking, and Lydia caught the faint tremor in Tom's hands as he wrapped his fingers around his mug again. He said he had carried this for 31 years, the guilt of knowing and saying nothing, and that seeing her dig now was both a relief and a worry. Lydia promised him she would be careful, though the certainty in her voice felt thin even to her own ears, and when they stepped out into the night, The air was heavy with the scent of rain, the kind that lingers when a storm is waiting to return. The county archives smelled of dust and old paper, the kind of dry, lingering scent that seemed to settle into the skin and clothes of anyone who stayed too long. Lydia had been there for hours, moving between tall shelves of battered file boxes, the overhead fluorescent lights humming softly above her. She had started with the obvious sections, the boxes labeled for emergency services in 9992, but most of what she found were routine reports, nothing she had not already seen in the case files her mother kept at home. It was in a lower drawer of a metal cabinet, tucked behind a stack of mislabeled property tax records, that she spotted the edge of a thin, unmarked folder. She slid it free carefully, brushing away a layer of dust, and saw that it contained several accident reports from June of that year, all clipped together, as if they had been filed by the same hand. The first few were ordinary enough, fender benders and minor injuries, but halfway through she stopped, her eyes catching on a name she did not recognize: Victor Kane. The report stated he had been injured late on the night of the 12th, the same night Claire had gone missing, and that his location had been noted as a rural stretch of road less than 2 miles from where the ambulance was found. Lydia read it twice, frowning at the strange gaps in the paperwork. There were no witness statements, no clear description of how he had been injured, only a brief note that medical attention had been rendered on site and that the matter was cleared. She turned to the address listed, intending to see if it connected to anything else in the records, and found that it did not appear in any county property files, either past or present. It was as if the place had never existed. She traced the line of the street name with her finger, the ink faded and slightly smudged, wondering if it had been written incorrectly or if it had been meant to hide something more deliberate. The more she looked at the file, the more it felt out of place, like a loose thread sewn into the wrong garment. She checked the other reports bundled with it, but none matched the oddities in Kane's. Her pulse quickened as she imagined Claire driving toward a call that might have been tied to this man, arriving to find him, or perhaps the circumstances surrounding him, not as they seemed. The silence of the archives pressed in around her as she copied the file number into her notebook, her pen scratching against the paper, the only sound in the room. She slipped the report back into the folder and returned it to its hiding place for the moment, not ready to draw attention to her find until she knew more. When she stepped outside into the pale afternoon light, the air smelled faintly of rain again, and she could not shake the feeling that she had just opened a door that had been meant to stay closed. The road leading out of town narrowed until it was little more than a cracked ribbon of asphalt cutting through open fields, the horizon stretching in muted shades of brown and grey under a sky that threatened rain. Lydia followed the directions she had pieced together from old maps and property records, each turn taking her farther from anything familiar, until the houses gave way to scattered farmsteads and empty pasture. The address from Victor Kane's report did not exist in the county registry, but tracing its nearest coordinates brought her here, to a weathered fence line, and the shape of a barn slumped against the earth as though it had been trying to stand too long. The roof had caved in on one side, the boards dark with rot, and weeds grew high around the leaning walls, their brittle stalks whispering in the wind. She pushed open what remained of the door, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and old hay, a lingering mustiness that clung to her throat. Light filtered through the gaps in the walls, casting pale slants across the debris. Her boots crunched over broken glass and splintered boards until she spotted a glint of metal half buried under a pile of collapsed rafters. Clearing it away, she uncovered a fragment of medical supply packaging, the county ambulance logo still visible beneath a layer of grime. Nearby, a length of canvas and leather caught her attention, stiff with age, yet unmistakable in form. An old stretcher strap coiled loosely on the floor, as though it had been dropped and forgotten. She crouched to examine it, her fingers brushing over the worn stitching, and felt a chill settle over her at the thought of how it had ended up here. Moving deeper into the shadows, she noticed a beam that had been partially shielded from the weather, its surface etched with faint markings. Leaning closer, she saw the letters CM carved into the wood, the lines rough but deliberate, as if done quickly with a blade or nail. Her breath caught in her throat, the initials instantly bringing Claire to mind, and she traced them lightly, wondering if her sister's hands had been here in this place, marking it as some desperate signal or remnant of herself. The wind outside picked up, rattling the loose boards and sending a thin stream of dust drifting through the air, the sound like a low groan from the building itself. Lydia stood still for a moment, the weight of the silence pressing against her, and listened, as if the space might offer some echo of what had happened within its walls. She pulled out her phone to take photos, the shutter clicks sounding sharp in the hush, and then stepped back toward the open doorway. The barn seemed to lean after her, as if reluctant to release what little it still held, and when she emerged into the grey light, the first cold drops of rain began to fall. The nursing home sat at the far end of a quiet street, its brick walls softened by ivy and its windows reflecting a pale, overcast sky. Inside, the air was warm and faintly scented with antiseptic and brewed coffee, a combination that seemed to cling to the halls. Lydia signed in at the front desk, her voice low as she gave the name she had come for, and followed a nurse down a carpeted corridor where muffled voices and the hum of a television drifted from open doors. They stopped outside a small room, and the nurse gave her a brief nod before stepping away. Victor Kane was sitting in a chair by the window, his frame thin beneath a grey cardigan, his skin pale and marked with the fine lines of age. He turned his head slowly when she entered, his eyes narrowing at first in curiosity, before softening into something that seemed like recognition, though Lydia was certain they had never met. She introduced herself and explained why she had come, mentioning Claire's name with careful precision. At the sound of it, Victor's hands tightened on the armrests, and he shifted slightly, leaning forward as if weighing the choice to speak. His voice, when it came, was soft and frayed, carrying the tremor of someone unused to talking for long. He said that on the night of the storm, Claire had arrived where she should not have, that she had seen something she was never meant to see, and that from the moment it happened, there had been no way back for her. His eyes seemed to lose focus for a moment, fixed somewhere beyond the room, and Lydia felt her pulse quicken, urging him to go on. But before he could finish, the door opened and a nurse stepped inside, smiling as she reminded him it was time for his medication. The interruption was brief, yet when she left and the room was quiet again, the air between them had changed. Victor sat back in his chair, his gaze turning away toward the window, and when Lydia asked him to continue, he shook his head slowly. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable now, stark against the pale of his skin, and it told her more than his words could have. He muttered something about not wanting trouble, about the past being better left buried, and she realized she would get nothing more from him today. She watched him for a moment longer, noting the way his hands trembled against the worn fabric of the chair, as though whatever he carried had not lessened in the 31 years since that night. When she finally stood to leave, he did not look at her, his gaze locked on the grey sky outside, and Lydia stepped quietly into the hall, the sound of her own footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, her mind turning over the fragment he had given her, aware it was both too little and far too much. The envelope was waiting on the floor just inside her apartment door, its plain surface marked only with her name in careful block letters and no return address. Lydia locked the door behind her, the sound of the rain outside a steady whisper against the windows, and bent to pick it up, feeling the faint weight of paper inside. At the table, she slid a finger under the flap, the glue giving way with a soft tear, and pulled out several folded sheets. The paper was slightly creased and smelled faintly of something metallic, like it had been stored in a drawer for years. As she unfolded them, she realized she was looking at dispatch logs, the headings and timestamps instantly familiar from the case files she had seen before, yet the columns here were longer, more detailed, and included entries she had never encountered. Her eyes moved quickly down the page, following the calls logged on the night of Claire's disappearance. There were multiple entries within the span of an hour, each reporting an incident in different parts of the county, each tied to the same originating phone number. Lydia's brow furrowed as she traced the details, noting that most of these calls had been assigned to units and then marked as resolved when nothing was found. But Claire's call stood out sharply, the only one from that number that had not been assigned to another crew before dispatch sent her. The entry was brief, vague in its description, just as Marla had once told her, but seeing it in writing, surrounded by the other calls, gave it a sinister clarity. This was not random. Someone had deliberately cleared the way for her sister to be the one who responded. Lydia's pulse quickened as she imagined the voice on the other end of that call, the calm precision it would have taken to set up the others as decoys to create the perfect cover. She scanned the margins for any notes, but the only markings were faint pencil initials she could not match to anyone she knew. Setting the pages down, she sat back in her chair, the hum of her refrigerator suddenly loud in the quiet, and tried to picture who would have sent these to her now. The timing felt deliberate, as though the investigation she had begun was drawing something, or someone, out of hiding. She folded the papers carefully, slipping them back into the envelope, and placed it in the top drawer of her desk, away from the photographs and recordings she had already gathered. Outside, the rain grew heavier, tapping harder against the glass, and she thought of Claire driving through a night like this, her radio crackling with the call that had led her away from safety. The logs were proof of something Lydia had suspected since the beginning, yet the knowledge brought no comfort, only the sense that she had just stepped deeper into a place where the air was thinner and the ground less steady, a place from which there might be no turning back. The sky was overcast when Lydia met Tom at the edge of the gravel road, the air heavy with the kind of damp stillness that often comes before rain. The trees loomed darker than she remembered, their dense canopy filtering the light into muted greens and greys, and the gravel crunched under their boots as they moved past the spot where the ambulance had once been found. Tom carried a small flashlight, though the day had not yet turned to evening, and Lydia kept her phone in hand, its camera ready. They stepped off the road and into the woods, the ground soft with years of fallen pine needles and the faint scent of moss rising in the air. Tom led the way, pushing aside low branches, his eyes scanning the uneven terrain as if he knew they were looking for something that did not want to be found. It was he who stopped first, his hand lifting in a silent signal, and Lydia followed his gaze to where a mound of earth bulged unnaturally from the forest floor. The mound was covered in thick moss, nearly blending into its surroundings, but at one end she could make out the dark, weathered wood of a trapdoor. Kneeling, she brushed away the damp growth, revealing the rusted hinges and the faint outline of a handle. Together they pulled it open, the hinges groaning in protest, and a cool draft rose from the darkness below, carrying the scent of old soil and mildew. The narrow stairs were slick with age, but they descended carefully, the beam from Tom's flashlight cutting through the shadows. At the bottom, the space opened into a small storm cellar, its walls lined with stone and its floor littered with debris. Lydia's eyes swept over the scene until they caught on a shape in the corner. A faded medic bag collapsed in on itself. She knelt and touched it, the canvas crumbling slightly under her fingers, and unfastened the rusted clasp. Inside, she found a county ambulance patch torn from a uniform. A roll of bandage stained a deep brown that time had not erased, and nestled within the folds of the fabric, a small metal key wrapped tightly in the cloth. She lifted the key into the light, its surface cold and mottled with rust, and turned it over in her palm, wondering what it had once opened. At the very bottom of the bag was Claire's ID badge, the photograph of her sister's face dimmed with age but still unmistakable. Lydia's throat tightened, her fingers closing gently around it, and she felt the air in the cellar grow heavier, as though the space itself remembered. Tom's hand rested briefly on her shoulder, grounding her in the moment, before they both looked back at the open trapdoor above, the grey light spilling in. They climbed out without speaking, the moss damp under their palms, and when they stood again in the quiet of the forest, the key and badge felt like a fragile link to a truth that had been buried far too long. The call from the police came just after sunrise, the pale light spilling across Lydia's kitchen table where the key, badge, and photographs lay in a careful arrangement, each one a silent witness to what had been found. The voice on the line was brisk but carried an undercurrent of weight, telling her they were reopening the case and moving quickly on the leads she had provided. By mid-morning, she was standing outside the county station, the damp air heavy with the smell of rain on pavement, as unmarked cars pulled in and uniformed officers moved with a sense of quiet urgency. Through the glass doors, she caught a glimpse of a man in handcuffs being led down the corridor, his head lowered, but his posture still carrying a faint defiance. She knew from the photographs she had studied that it was Alan Greaves, the former EMS supervisor, who had once seemed like an unshakable fixture in the department. In the briefing room, an officer explained that Greaves had confessed after several hours of questioning, his voice steady when he admitted that Claire had uncovered his role in a smuggling operation that had been running quietly through the county for years. The staged emergency call, he said, had been meant to bring her to a location where she could be intercepted before she had the chance to report him, a place remote enough that no one would stumble upon it by accident. But he had not expected her to resist, and when she fought back, the plan shifted. She had been taken, he admitted, somewhere she would never be found. Lydia sat in the hard-backed chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, listening to the words with the strange sense that she had been holding her breath for 31 years and was only now remembering how to let it out. The officers spoke of further searches, of names that Greaves had given them, of property that would be combed over inch by inch. She thought of the night of the storm, of her sister driving into the black wall of rain with her sirens cutting through the wind, unaware that the voice on her radio was guiding her toward danger. Outside, the sound of a car door slamming echoed sharply, and Lydia turned to see Greaves being led toward a waiting cruiser, his wrists bound in front of him, his expression unreadable. For a moment their eyes met, and she wondered if he saw her as the sister of the woman he had silenced, or simply as another face in the long chain of consequences he had managed to outrun until now. The cruiser pulled away, its tires hissing over wet asphalt, and Lydia felt the air shift, not with relief, but with the knowledge that the door to the truth had been forced open, and what lay beyond it would not be easily forgotten or forgiven. The river was wide and slow-moving at the bend where the search teams had gathered, its surface a dull silver under a pale morning sky. Weeks had passed since Greaves's arrest, the days filled with interviews, evidence catalogues, and the steady unraveling of secrets that had been knotted for decades. Yet nothing had prepared Lydia for the call that the divers had found something. She stood on the muddy bank, the damp earth soft beneath her boots, watching as a small boat moved slowly across the water, its wake breaking the mirrored surface. The air smelled of silt and wet leaves, and the only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the quiet voices of officers working along the shoreline. When the divers surfaced, their movements deliberate, one of them carried a small waterproof bag that was passed to the lead investigator with a gravity that needed no explanation. Inside were human remains and a wristwatch, the metal dulled but intact, the hands frozen at a time long past. Lydia recognized it instantly. The simple silver band with its narrow face, the same one she had seen on Claire's wrist in countless photographs and in her memories of their last morning together. The DNA confirmation came days later, and with it, the certainty she had both longed for and dreaded. The funeral was small, held in the same church where their family had once gathered for summer weddings and winter services, the wooden pews polished to a soft sheen, the air carrying the faint scent of lilies. Lydia sat near the front, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, listening as the minister spoke of service, courage, and the long road to truth. Her grief was sharp and immediate, a hollow ache that no passage of time had dulled, yet beneath it was something steadier, a weight lifted by knowing her sister's story no longer ended in unanswered questions. When the service ended, the small procession moved to the cemetery, where the ground was soft from days of gentle rain. The casket was lowered into the earth beside the headstone that had stood for years without her resting there, the flowers placed carefully along its edge bright against the grey day. A fine drizzle began to fall, cool drops brushing Lydia's face, so unlike the violent storm that had swallowed Claire all those years ago. She stood for a long time after the others had stepped away. The world around her hushed, except for the faint patter of rain on leaves, and whispered her last goodbye, the words catching in her throat but carrying with them a release she had not thought possible. For the first time in decades, she felt that Claire could rest, and in that quiet space between sorrow and peace, Lydia knew that though the loss would remain, the truth had finally brought her sister home.